There have been instances of civil protest in this country, from the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s to the Black Lives Matter protest movement in 2020. 100 years ago, though, the largest uprising in U.S. history since the Civil War occurred in the heart of Appalachia in Logan County, West Virginia. Today, we tell the story of the Battle of Blair Mountain. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. By the way, be sure to go down below and click that subscribe button and ding the bell so you get notification of all our stories as they come out to you. And if you don't care, give us a thumbs up too.
Wow, Blair Mountain. Just saying the words and the name of Blair Mountain conjures up all of these visions of all the things that the miners went through in this battle that went on for, a long time, days, almost weeks, I think. But I'm telling you, it was a big pivotal part, I think, of the union movement. It started the downhill slide, but then it also started the uphill swing too, just as much for the mine workers as you'd started kind of seeing that drop off a little bit.
Yeah, and what happened at Blair Mountain was actually that final explosion from 20 years of what's called the West Virginia Mine Wars, which we've told a lot of stories about, some very horrendous things and some very tragic things over the past few years.
It was that spark in the powder keg.
It was. And what happened at Blair Mountain, as I said, was the culmination of those mine wars, in which miners fought quite literally the coal mine owners for a decent wage and decent working conditions. What led to the confrontation on Blair Mountain started the year before, in 1920, in the town of Matewan.
There, on May 19th, a gun battle erupted between Police Chief Sid Hatfield, distant relative to Devil Anse Hatfield, and his deputies, along with agents of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, who had been hired by local mine owners to come to town and evict striking miners from company-owned housing. Now, that fight left several important Baldwin Felts men dead, along with the mayor of Matewan. Hatfield was tried and found, of course, not guilty of the murder of Albert Felts in early of 1921.
In May 1921, Union miners decided to take matters into their own hands. Tired of being forced to work for little pay and facing no jobs at all because of imported replacements, scabs as they came to be known, the Union miners launched an assault on non-Union mines, which soon led to a full-scale rebellion in the Tug River Valley, which lasted for 3 days. Things got so bad, martial law was imposed, and an uneasy truce was declared. Meanwhile, Sid Hatfield was indicted on a charge of being involved in blowing up a coal tipple during that unrest and was set to be tried in Welch on August 1st, 1921, but was gunned down on the courthouse steps by Baldwin Felts men. At least 3,000 attended the funeral of Hatfield and his deputy, Ed Chambers, who was also killed. And Rod, this was the trigger for the largest labor uprising in American history.
Indeed, Steve, because miners throughout southern West Virginia began to go and take up arms and start organizing themselves. Miners in Logan County, West Virginia, started patrolling the area, guarding their homes and personal property. This alarmed the powers that be so much that the sheriff, Don Chafin, sent his deputies into the area along Little Coal River to disarm the miners. Those miners turned the tables on the law, capturing those deputies and disarming them, and then sent them on their way as fast as they could run. But a week after Hatfield's assassination on August 7th, the United Mine Workers of America called a rally at the state capitol in Charleston. The leaders of this rally, Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, met with the governor and presented him with a petition of the miners' demands. The governor, in the meantime, Ephraim Morgan, summarily dismissed those demands. And we'll tell you a little bit about someone else named Keeney a little bit later on in the podcast.
Well, angered at the death of Sid Hatfield, those miners in Charleston started to talk of marching directly to Logan County to end martial law and to organize the county for the UMWA. At a rally that night, labor leader Mother Jones called on the miners not to march to Logan and Mingo counties and set up the Union by force. She was fearful of a bloodbath in any battle between the miners and the heavily armed Logan County deputies. Even though she was revered by the miners, though, her words had little effect, and the men decided to march anyway. Armed men began to gather at Lynch Creek Mountain in Kanawha County, ready to proceed south on August 20th. By the 24th, there were about 13,000 more men there who began to march towards Logan County. Another group of miners decided they wanted to join them, so they took over a Chesapeake and Ohio train and renamed it the Blue Steel Special to meet up with the marchers in Danville. Meanwhile, Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney left the state for Ohio as they felt they'd be prime targets for the authorities trying to stop the march. And replacing them in the leadership role on the ground was a fiery pro-union man named Bill Blizzard, who would lead the march to Logan and Mingo counties.
Well, meeting them on the way would be none other than Sheriff Don Chafin and his deputies, assisted by a private armed force of around 2,000 men provided by the Logan County Coal Operators Association on the top of Blair Mountain, which stood between the miners and their goal. The armed miners made it to Blair Mountain on the morning of August 25th, 1921. Alarmed at the potential for armed revolt, President Warren Harding threatened to send in federal troops and Martin MB-1 bombers to attack the miners. Now, we're talking airplanes. But after the meeting in Madison and Boone County, the miners were convinced it would be the best for them to return home. And that would have been that, except for Sheriff Chafin.
You see, about as soon as the meeting ended in Madison, word started to spread that Chafin had shot Union sympathizers in the town of Sharples, and that women and children had been caught in the crossfire. Thus ended that agreement to go home. The miners, enraged at Chafin's reported actions, resumed their march, determined to go to war if they had to. On August 29th, that war started. Chafin's men were outnumbered by the marching miners, but he had an advantage. He was at the top of the mountain, and he had much better weaponry. Shots began being fired, and soon the two groups were in a full-scale battle on the mountain. Chafin then started firing, believe it or not, poison gas from World War I at the miners, who had no gas mask to protect themselves. He then hired airplanes to drop World War I bombs on the miners, the first time an aerial bombing was used in the U.S. against American citizens. Those Martin bombers were used by the U.S. military for aerial surveillance against the miners, with one bomber crashing on the mountainside, but none of the military planes engaged in bombing the miners. Now, by August 30th, Governor Morgan decided to consolidate command of the government and volunteer forces under Colonel William Eubanks of the West Virginia National Guard. Fighting continued, however, with reports of some of the miners making it to Logan and Mingo counties. On September 2nd, Rod, federal troops arrived and everything changed.
That's right, Steve. Many of the miners were World War I vets, and they had tremendous respect for the U.S. military. As a result, they refused to fire on the American soldiers. So, at the direction of Bill Blizzard, the men started heading home the next day, hiding their guns in the woods before and, doing so, getting home. In all, around 30 deaths were reported on Sheriff Chafin's side and 50 to 100 on the miner side. After the end of the conflict, the government of West Virginia brought charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and treason against 985 marchers at Blair Mountain. Those found guilty were imprisoned for terms lasting for years, but they were pretty quickly paroled, with the last one being released around 1925.
Yeah, Bill Blizzard and Frank Keeney also had charges brought against them, but the leader of those miners, Bill Blizzard, was acquitted after introducing an unexploded aerial bomb at his trial as evidence of the use of undue force in the battle. Keeney, too, was acquitted. The end of the battle saw the UMWA lose power, with membership going from 50,000 miners to about 10,000 during the 1920s. This resulted in the Union being undermined throughout Appalachia, with Illinois being the only remaining unionized state. It wasn't until well into the next decade, by 1935, that the UMWA finally organized the Southern West Virginia coal fields. The incident did, however, bring to light the terrible conditions under which miners and their families lived in the coal camps. It also convinced the Union that political action, rather than outright rebellion, was a better way to change those conditions, with the passage of new laws and new regulations that protected labor.
The site of the battle itself has been a target for strip mining over the years by Arch Coal and Massey Energy, which held permits to blast and strip the coal from Blair Mountain. On March 30th, 2009, Blair Mountain was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, but court actions kept the status of the mountain uncertain for years, mainly because the state of West Virginia and its Historic Preservation Office had failed to notarize all objections, leading to it being removed from the register that same year. After years in the courts, that order was overturned in April of 2016 with a decision as to whether it would be re-added to the Register of Historic Places was given to the keeper of the National Register. On June 27, 2018, the keeper's office confirmed that Blair Mountain was again on the National Register of Historic Places and was protected.
Now, do you know whatever happened to Frank Keeney?
Well, I know the name Keeney because I think we're getting ready to talk about, is it his grandson later on down the line?
We're going to get to that here in a second, but Frank
Okay,
Keeney
well, go
himself,
ahead.
yeah, he became a world class rank and file leader. Um,
Oh, that's right.
After he left the UMWA, he went out and he started his own organizing campaign for a separate union
Hmm.
and did so well that at a point in March 1931, when there were only 600 members of the UMWA, Mr. Keeney had picked up for his West Virginia Mine Workers Union 20,000 members.
Wow.
Now, that union lasted for 2 years until it collapsed due to lack of finances. And he continued his activities with the Progressive Miners of America. But after the collapse of that organization, he just said, I guess to heck with it, and left the labor movement, ended up running a nightclub in Charleston, and
Hmm.
later worked as a parking lot attendant before passing away at the age of 88.
Wow. Kind of a sad end right there with everything kind of coming apart. I mean, the nightclub thing may have not been a bad thing altogether, but then you kind of drop down to parking lot assistant, or, that's not exactly where you like to end up and everything. But let's get back to that name again, Keeney. And I was
Mhm.
mentioning there, and you stopped me, but are we talking about grandson Chuck Keeney by chance?
Charles Chuck Keeney, who is a
Hmm.
assistant professor of history at Southern West Virginia Community College and is very well known for his activities regarding Appalachian history.
Hmm.
He's appeared in several movies, I think, including Matewan
Hmm.
and the Mine Wars movies that were on PBS as
Hmm.
a commentator. I follow him on Twitter. He's a very
I do too.
interesting fellow to follow and is very involved in things all doing with the Mine Wars. In fact, he is one of the forces behind the Mine Wars Museum there in Matewan, which just upgraded its facilities to have a basically a world class experience whenever you go up there to visit and find out about Appalachian history.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I think a couple of weeks ago is when they did that. And of course, this will be old by the time the recording and everything. But Cecil Roberts, who was the president of the United Mine Workers, was there for the unveiling of that Mine Wars Museum. And I want to say that they named a building or something right there in that part of Matewan, I think, after Cecil Roberts. But it's a great way to be able to go and experience, or at least get an idea of what the Mine Wars were all about. But I remember a lot of tweets coming from Chuck Keeney, especially going from I guess in 2009, starting about that time, and a lot of it was aimed at Don Blankenship with Massey Coal because of
Yeah.
what they were wanting to do about stripping and so forth, and kind of exposing and telling the truth to a lot of people that already knew what kind of person Don Blankenship was at that time.
And folks, that's the story of the Battle of Blair Mountain 100 years ago this summer. Another part of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Audible, Radio Public, or on your favorite podcast app. Until next we meet, take care. So long, everybody.
So long.